Ladies and gentlemen, dear Corinne, I was asked to speak in English, so I speak in English, although my mother tongue is German. But to balance the audience, I think this is appropriate. Let me just say that a lot has been said on authority, and we have dwelled on the different perspective of authorities in state, private institution, religious authorities, professional authorities. We have discussed force, power, consent, acquiescence, physical and intellectual power and authorities, and we have discussed trust, values, and offering a sense of meaning here in the context of authority. And I will abduct you in a very different world from what you have discussed till now this afternoon. And I'm abducting you into the world of violence and conflict, where the institution I represent, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has been active over the last 150 years to preserve humanity through law, to influence policy making, and to assist and protect people in some of the worst circumstances of the world in which they can find themselves. Let me just make 5 points this afternoon as an introduction and in my speech. I will first say a few things on the failures of authorities to respond to aspirations of people. I will then say something on what we observe as the ICRC in the transformation of authority in the battlefields, in the conflicts in which we operate today. I will then say something on the authority of the law, because as ICRC, we represent the Geneva Convention, the most largest ratified international instruments, and therefore we are affected by the authority of the law. I will say something on the cost for individuals and communities when authority breaks down. That's what we are witnessing today. And then hopefully say a few things on the possibility of reconstituting authority through neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action. First, on the failure and transformation of authority. If you want to measure what happened with authority in armed conflict over the last 150 years, then look at the history of ICRC. From 5 founding fathers with a few volunteers helping them, we have become an organization of 15,000 professionals with a yearly budget of 1.7 billion and active in more than 86 countries of the world at the present moment. We are part of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the largest social movement in the world, in which more than 100 million people are organized, and where each and every day 17 million volunteers work together with us to help people when authority broke down and when states fail to assist and protect their own people. First, when we were created in the 19th century, we dealt with the wounded in the field, with the soldiers in the field, then with prisoners of war in the First World War. We turned our attention to the civilians. And today, of course, the civilians affected by armed conflict are those people which are the people of concern to us when authority is breaking down and when we are basically struggling with the situation in which we find ourselves. So the transformation of authority, the theme of this debate today for the ICRC is not an abstract question. It's a daily experience throughout our history, which has reinforced over the last 5 years. Just to give you an impression, we have only in the last 5 years doubled our budget, our operational budget, which is a reflection of the decomposition of authorities in many countries of the world combined with violence. And so this leaves us with a huge paradoxon today with which we are confronted. It has been said by Corinne in her introduction. With more people than ever in history of mankind, connected, educated, healthy, and wealthy on the one side, and on the other side with institutions and authorities constantly improving their performance, And then on the other side, the lack of access to basic services, high levels of violence, economic injustice, poor governance and corruption in an increasingly broad area of the world. Let's just imagine that 700 million people are living below poverty lines, and well over 2 billion people live in fragile contexts and contexts of fragility today and are dependent on humanitarian assistance and protection services. So it is the very essence of conflict that authority is questioned, and that violence is often direct consequence of this questioning of authorities. Let's take the Arab Spring as an example. The Arab Spring did not start as a rebellion of terrorists against government. It was a rebellion of the poor people against the rich. It was a rebellion of those people experiencing injustice, discrimination and marginalization by the respective authorities. But the dynamics in the society led to an enormous level of violence, which then again had a deep impact on societies and unfolded the fabric of societies. So in many places where we operate, we see conflicting relationships between different religious, political, tribal, economic, and societal dividing lines, with a high prevalence of violence and no legitimate political process leading to consensus on the future of society. This is, of course, similar to what we are happening in Europe, but on a very, very different scale of experiencing of people. We are not discussing Brexit here, we are discussing survival. And this is a huge difference in perspective. When we look at what we experience in so many situations, it's discrimination, exclusion, injustice, poverty, where countries fail and governments fail to integrate the differences in their own society. So it's the lack of authority and the lack of authority which attend to the diversity in society, which preoccupies us most and which in many times is at the origin of the conflicts with which we are confronted. My second point is that when we look into conflicts and battlefields and front lines where we are each and every day, and our delegates are each and every day, what preoccupies us in the last couple of years is the huge fragmentation of powers and authorities, the destructured conflict and the unclear command and control with which we are confronted. This is not anymore the Second World War or a liberation war in the 1960s, where we had two parties. Now, when we bring humanitarian assistance from Kabul to Mazar al-Sharif, from Damascus to Aleppo, we have 20, 30, 40 checkpoints. And all those checkpoints are under the control of a different armed group or on different military units. And so we experience in the conflicts in which we are enormous fragmentations of powers. And this is true for the Middle East, it's true for the Lake Chad region in Africa, for the Sudans, Afghanistan, but it is also true now for Europe. Let's be very frank. If we look at Ukraine or if we look at Nagorno-Karabakh, again, we see that the continent of Europe, which we thought would be a safe place. And when I started 4 years ago at the ICRC, I thought I would move out of Europe with our humanitarian operations. We are back in Europe with the 7th largest operation worldwide in Ukraine, with an important operation in Nagorno-Karabakh, and with other operations also, humanitarian operations scaling up in the context of migration. In these contexts, a number of state and non-state actors are engaged and against each other in an increasing number of battlefields. States are operating with armed forces in secret or remote mode, using drones, robotics, and sophisticated cyber technologies, while non-state actors pretending to be states and aspiring to be states behave like states. Look, for instance, at Hamas or Hezbollah, at al-Nusra and the Islamic State, at Boko Haram and the Taliban. They are not just asserting their power through military means. They are also delivering and aspiring to deliver services to the civilian population. And that's the reason why they are stronger than you would expect, and you can't fight them only militarily, because they do not only coerce people, they also deliver services and aspire to deliver those services. So on the one side, we see in the conflicts in which we are active a destructuring and fragmentation of powers, but within the respective parties to conflict, we see increasingly authoritarian development of authoritarian structures, not surprisingly, because they are in war and conflicts. So authoritarian power is expanding within the different group. And so for here again, we see this enormous paradoxon that on the one side we have a fragmentation of powers in conflict, and on the other hand, we have more assertive, more authoritarian power that we are confronted with. My third point is, what does it mean for the law? And for international humanitarian law and for implementing international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. With fragmentation and violence come most visible for us the evaporation of trust into the law of war, which has deep impact on the authority of this legal framework. Most elementary rules and behaviors of war are violated in many of today's conflicts. And while it is nothing new for us, we have seen after all the Holocaust and genocide and 150 years of conflicts all over the world, there are some peculiarities and some specificities in today's dynamics which are very particular. These dynamics are actually quite simple, I have to tell you. Belligerents today normally know that military force needs precaution, that civilians have to be protected, women and children have to be spared, hospitals not attacked, detainees treated in a humane way and not tortured. But in many places where we operate and we interact, we see that they lack the confidence that the other side will implement the law as well. Let me just recall, a couple of weeks ago, I was in al-Nusra-controlled territory of Syria, and I was discussing a whole afternoon with one of the chief commanders of al-Nusra. He knows the Geneva Conventions better than I do. He knows every article. He knows what the behaviors of the law is, but he doesn't have the trust that this law will be applied to his detainees and to his civilian population under his control as long and he is not ready to respect it towards the civilian population under the control of the government of Syria. So it is a lack of trust, it's not a lack of knowledge, which at the present moment is deeply affecting us. The totalitarian rhetoric and practice of today's warfare, the dehumanization of the adversary, the hyper-politicization of the law, which is used primarily to publicly expose the adversary, to stigmatize the adversary. The communicative environment, which was referred to many times this afternoon, plays a crucial role in bringing to the global space the violation and the lack of trust into this legal system. And this adds a different element of quality with which we are confronted and challenges with which we are confronted. So while international humanitarian law for decades has been the below the radar screen discipline of militaries and lawyers and academics and the International Committee of the Red Cross, trying to find practical solution for the dilemmas between military necessity and protection of civilians, today violations of international law unfold in a highly communicative environment, which is becoming kind of an extended battlefield. It's not by chance that those who have been killed publicly by Islamic State on the beaches of the Mediterranean have been put into orange jumpsuits. Orange jumpsuits, the same style and type that the Americans are using in Guantanamo. It's politics by symbols. It's killing by symbols. It's using warfare by symbolic violence more than by actual violence, or would I say by a combination of actual brutality with communicative brutality. So one side, what is underlining this highly politicized environment is that one side is accusing the other side of violations of the Geneva Convention, of war crimes and crimes against humanity, all sides using legal accountability as a political tool rather than an obvious and non-political consequence of violence and violations of the law. While the dominant story in the news talks about indiscriminate terrorist attacks in an increasing number of conflicts in today's world, our evidence and our empirics show something different. The ICRC over the last 5 years has collected data on attacks on hospitals. And perversely, we see that attacks on hospitals are happening almost at equal quality by state and non-state actors. And both state and non-state actors are more often responsible for attacks on hospitals than criminals are. So criminals behave better in today's conflicts than state and non-state actors, which is quite a striking experience that we make in those contexts. So when minimal common ground is lacking between belligerents, when there is no common humanity as the basis of authorities, wars have no limits and unfortunately wars have no end. And this is the situation in many conflicts in which we find ourselves. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that the Syrian conflict is lasting five years, but the Lebanese conflict next door has lasted for 15 and 20 years. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is on his way for 70 years now. And so one of the reasons that we see more of those long-term conflicts which affect the fabrics of societies. Paradoxically, again, civilians are the objects of competition between states and non-state actors increasingly on the delivery of services. Many of you will remember Russian convoys to eastern Ukraine. Of course, eastern Ukraine needs Russian humanitarian assistance, but of course it's a politicized assistance where there is a competition over who can deliver humanitarian assistance, and this is again politicizing further the situation in which we find ourselves. Let me say, as my fourth point, something on the impact and transformation of authorities on people and some of the cost of conflict that we are experiencing today. What we see in those 15, 20 most active conflicts in which we are is that violence is not anymore just temporary and local. It's systemic. It attacks systems. What we see is that it's not just civilians affected, people affected, but it's health system, educational system, social systems affected. There is no health system anymore in between Syria, Iraq, and Yemen today. There is no educational system. Millions of kids for the 5th year are now out of school. So that's a lost generation. It's not individuals only affected by conflict, it's systems affected. Affection by conflict is long-term, not anymore short-term. You can't evade it, you can flee, but then you come into non-performing social systems in neighboring countries. It's contagious. All the countries which are fragile contexts and which host the largest refugee crowds in the world are neighboring countries of conflict, contrary to what Europeans think. Not everybody wants to come to Europe. Most of the refugees in the world, 2/3 of all the refugees in the world live in neighboring countries where conflict takes place. In Ethiopia, in Pakistan, in Iran. These are the countries where the large majorities of people are displaced. So it's fragile system, it's long-term, it's contagious, and therefore it leaves more people vulnerable than any time before. Also, let me impress on you that today's violence is in one more place very specific. It's urbanized. Today's conflict are urban conflict, which are much more vulnerable and affect much more fabrics of the society than warfare in an open battlefield. It is not by chance that when you think about conflict today, you think about Aleppo, Lugansk, Donetsk. It's about big cities that we think, and these cities are gradually destroyed, and their social fabric and social systems are destroyed. You bomb the electric plant of Aleppo, you don't get water, and you don't get electricity, and you don't get any social systems, and you don't get the operation theater in the hospital running. So cities are much more vulnerable. And this is, of course, in a community like yours, should particularly concern to you, because the big growth rate of the world economy is happening in cities, while the big violence and vulnerability of violence and conflict is happening in the cities. And when I mention cities, let me just make another point. It's that violence and the destruction of social fabric and social services in societies do not happen only in the Syrias, Afghanistans and Yemens and Somalias and Sudans of today. Out of the 50 most violent cities of the world, 47 are in Latin America. Last year, Brazil had a higher death toll through firearms than Syria. So there is something, a perception issue that we are considering. We had months last year, the first 3 months of 2015, have seen more people killed by firearms in Salvador than in Iraq and Syria together. So we see that violence is spreading and globalizing. And therefore, my point here in beautifully and provocatively beautiful Salzburg is, let's consider that maybe Europe, besides all the difficult decision on the construct and the future of Europe, is a continent not anymore so protected from this violence. We have seen it through the terrorist attacks in Paris and Munich and other places. But violence is moving increasingly into the suburb of highly developed and industrialized countries, and it's destroying the fabrics, and it's causing enormous needs. Let me just throw at you a couple of figures. Today, the estimate is that violence and warfare is accountable for 12 to 14 trillion US dollar costs per year, which is basically 10% of global GDP. The international humanitarian assistance almost doubled in the last 10 years and is now more important than all the peacekeeping operations of the UN together. A record number of people are displaced. Never in Europe, never in the world have there been so many people displaced since the Second World War as today. 60 million displaced, 20 million out of the 60 million are refugees, 40 million are displaced within their own country. But they are displaced and they haven't seen their houses and their apartments sometimes in many years. I just come back again from Afghanistan. I've been in Jalalabad where I met communities which haven't been back to their places for 15 years. They are displaced for 15 years and they are moving and migrating around their country, eventually temporarily going to the next country. So displacement is at a proportion which we have never seen before. So we see an enormous gap between the needs which are emerging, the social needs which are emerging of people affected by violence and warfare, and the ability of humanitarian organizations, of states, of authority to cope with those enormous needs. So what can be done? Of course, I could make a cheap publicity trick with you and tell you all the wonderful things we are doing. And of course, the standard program of humanitarian assistance is important. Humanitarian, we can scale up operations, we can do more, we can enlarge our donor base, we can cooperate more broadly with the private sector, we can innovate, we can be more effective and efficient, we can throw all those words at you and at others, but this is, I don't think, the point. Where I think the biggest point is how can we re-establish trust in society and re-establish social fabrics in society. And neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action may be a reasonable first step, although not a sufficient step to do so. You may find it ridiculously modest, what I tell you, but exchanging Red Cross messages from a family who thinks that their brother, their father, their children are in detention somewhere and they get a message out of detention is an enormously important issue for the people themselves. So keeping communication between the front lines open, between detainees, between families who have been separated by violence and conflicts is enormously important. Bringing humanitarian assistance into the most impossible places is important. Negotiating with all parties to the conflict access to besieged areas, to places which haven't seen any international support in years is terribly important, although awfully modest. It will not change the dynamics of conflict, but it will change the lives of those people. So negotiating agreements, renegotiating trust in the society in which we work is critically important. All these approaches are terribly modest in ambition and result, yet preserving a minimal space of humanity is, in our experience and in the majority of the most difficult situation, the first and most critical step to do to rebuild authority in society. Such an approach seems in stark contradiction to the political mood of our time, when the fight against extremism and terrorism is the dominating trend in public rhetoric. And the whole rhetoric of war occupies all the attention in the public space. Let me say this is a misunderstanding. As humanitarians, we do not take positions with regard to the use ad bellum and issues, with regard to the legitimacy of warfare. We though strongly recommend a cautious approach in the use of force in today's struggle with terrorist attacks. The approach described also seems at odds with the impression in many of today's conflict that extremists and terrorists are not really willing to enter a conversation, like the one described above on minimal standards of humanity. And here again, I would caution all of us. 10 years ago, everybody told us it's impossible to talk to the Taliban. Today, we have constant relations with the Taliban. 15 years ago, everybody told us this is impossible to talk to the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. But today, we entertain a major humanitarian operation in Somalia. So let's not take hasty decisions. And just let me conclude with, once again, this key message of mine that when countries are affected by violence and conflict, neutral and impartial humanitarian assistance and building and rebuilding trust in society may be the first and most reasonable first step to entertain. Thank you very much. Ja, 2-3 Fragen.
Wir haben noch Zeit für ein paar Fragen. Herr Matusek.
Peter, we were also proud when we developed the concept of humanitarian of responsibility to protect in 2005. We spent many, many hours and were proud when we got it embodied in the Millennium Document, and this was a shining example how the authority of the international community could intervene in another country to prevent genocide. Now, it has totally disappeared, at least from my radar screen. What happened with it?
Well, I think what happened is that there is there are fundamental divisions of interpretation in the international community on what responsibility to protect means. And that's the fact, and that's the reason why it is not anymore a terribly useful concept, because it divides in its interpretation quite fundamentally the Russian and Iranians from the Americans and Europeans, if we discuss Syria or Ukraine. And responsibility to protect has been used by the Russians to say that they have to go into eastern Ukraine, and it has been used by the Americans and Europeans to say that the sovereignty of Syria has to be considered, has to be reconsidered, and they have to intervene at least humanitarily in Syria. So the concepts are used in a completely different way. We lack political consensus on some of the biggest crises of the world, and that's the reason why these crises muddle through forward, and why we are increased with these enormous costs of conflict. And as long as we don't have political consensus on what exactly the concept means and what exactly powers are ready to do, we will not find solutions to these conflicts, and the bills of humanitarian assistance will just skyrocket.
Danke. War da die nächste Frage?
Good afternoon. My name is Salman Mari. First of all, I just want to say that that was one of the most inspirational speeches I've heard, and I can only imagine the horrors that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Most of us are not exposed to that in our whole lifetime. The one word I didn't hear in your lecture, although you alluded to it indirectly, was diplomacy. Why has there been such a breakdown of financial and global institutions? Why is there such a weakening of authority of institutions like the United Nations and others? I can see the ICRC possibly seems to be really at the front line of what should be the role of many other major multilateral political institutions. When conflict occurs, the first thing we do is we slam sanctions on. Your people work on the ground. You talked about Ukraine. We slam sanctions on Russia. We close the front door. We open 10 back doors for them. President Putin is now selling assets to China and to, building a whole new global geopolitical consensus. Why has there been such an erosion of institutions, and how can we fix that?
Well, I can tell you what I try to do to fix it is to impress on the cost of conflict when I interact with all the parties and those behind the parties to the conflict. And I think over the last 5 years, the big powers in the world which operate behind or in the conflicts which are costing the most of the costs in today's world have not assessed correctly the cost of the conflict and the cost for themselves. That this system of defending interests and not negotiating, and the lack of diplomacy would bear on themselves. It has destroyed the institutions which they are part of, and through refugees and through humanitarian bills and development gains which are lost, basically the bill is now rising. And that's the first time where, again, you had a little bit of reason coming back to the system, and the Americans and the Russians starting to re-emphasize the importance of diplomacy. But I think it is our task as humanitarians to draw the attention of all the decision makers in the world about the enormous costs that the lack of diplomacy has, the juxtaposition of interest, and the fact that today the defense of interest through military means, or the continuation of diplomacy by military means, as a famous German strategist said in the 19th century, is again seen as legitimate. And I think before there is a recalculation of costs in the major capitals of the world, which will bring back diplomacy, we will probably see a further degradation of the situation.
Okay. Da waren jetzt Herr Professor Ritschl, und dann war da die Frage, gleich.
Albrecht Ritschl from the LSE. That famous German strategist was then continuing by saying that during war, politics always continues and the problem starts if it doesn't. And that's my question I have for you in terms of the rules of engagement as you by necessity are talking to all the parties. The temptation must be huge for some of the parties to relay messages to the other party using you as a messenger. Doesn't that create terribly difficult conflicts of interest? What would the rules of engagement be? I'm sure you won't divulge secrets here, that's pretty clear, but this must be hugely difficult for the one party that is definitely there on the ground and is committed to talking to everybody, because otherwise you cannot do your work.
Well, my assessment after 4 years of being in those difficult situations is clearly that we need to have utmost self-restraint in playing a role of in-between between parties. And we have to limit ourselves to strictly humanitarian issues. We can't go political, because once we go political, then we lose the legitimacy to talk to all sides. So it's really, in today's world, it's really our mediation possibilities are really with regard to assisting and protecting people, accessing people, delivering basic social services. When we go into more ambitious political processes, we need others to step in.
Herr Maurer, ich bekomme Zeichen, dass Sie leider gehen müssen.
Ich habe
Obwohl hier
leider
noch eine
einen.
ganz wichtige Frage war. Fragen Sie ganz schnell, ganz schnell. Und dann müssen Sie gehen.
Ja.
Thank you. Nico Rabe. One quick question. Which is the institutions going forward that are most likely to reinstall order? Is it the United Nations and the Security Council? Is it the G20? Is it the G7? Is it NATO? Because we have been talking about institutions, but I'm wondering which is the institutions that are going forward?
I would like to make
ones.
the connector to the discussion beforehand. I think at the end of the day, we are in a situation today where states have to renegotiate the basic contract under which they want to operate all those institutions. And so the responsibility goes back to leadership and states. We don't have intrinsic, neither in the United Nations, nor in the G20, nor in any other existing institution, the legitimacy to override state power at the present moment. We need a new bargain. We need a new social contract. We need a new political and diplomatic contract to make those institutions function. And this responsibility is with states and not with the institutions themselves. I'm sorry. Herzlichen Dank. Bis bald.
Vielen Dank, bis bald.